Hey guys, Jim Vanosky with Manufacturing Talks here. If you are a whiskey or bourbon or dark rum fan, this is an episode you've got to check out. Um, you guys, if you are fans of that, you know that those spirits are made in part by barrel aging for years and years in a lot of cases. And the guy joining us today name's Allan Evans. He is a co-founder of a company called BarrelRM. And what they've figured out is a way to reduce that barrel aging time from years and years and years to a day. Yeah, I know it's hard to believe, but he's here to tell you the story. And you really want to check this out and check his stuff out. And stay tuned to hear the details here on Manufacturing Talks.
Welcome to Manufacturing Talks with Jim Vanosky. Industry has a million cool stories, and Jim talks to the movers and shakers who are making them happen. Let's dive in.
EYS Media, your digital media relations agency. Public relations, website design, digital marketing. You get found by the customers and talent who need your solutions. You get media placements in top publications, the best job candidates coming to your website, a digital presence that gets you found by the right people. Call 616-298-8798 to get started today.
Okay, yeah, welcome back to Manufacturing Talks. Appreciate you being here. I am Jim Vanosky, your host, and we, as always, thank our sponsor, DYS Media. Great guys. Look them up for sure. Got the link in the text on the YouTube show and our podcast outlets. And I'm really happy to be joined today by a guy I've known for a while now and been tracking what he's up to, a guy named Allan Evans. He is a founder of a company called BarrelRM that he's here to tell us all about. Exciting stuff. So welcome, Allan.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And it has been a few years now, so I'm excited to finally get to talk about what we're doing. We had to stay quiet for a while we figured it out.
And that's kind of cool. You know, that's part of the story we definitely want to talk about. But I was just thinking when I was looking through emails the other day that, yeah, we've been talking about this a while, and you guys are now ready to be a little more public. And so that's why you're here. So, you know, before we talk about BarrelRM, tell us about your background and then what led you to where you are today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was a little bit of a vagabond for a long time. I ended up getting my PhD at the University of Michigan in microfluidics. Traveled the world for a year doing charity work, ended up at a national lab, started a AR/VR company called Avegant, which we moved to San Francisco, raised a lot of money from Intel Capital. As part of that, we started to build a product called the Glyph. And that product took me to China. You know, consumer electronics manufacturing for a lot of years, a lot of nights over there. I learned a whole lot of things I didn't know about building stuff for electronics and tooling for plastics and everything else. Mm-hmm. And toward the end of my time doing that, a friend and I were drinking scotch. And this was when the price of scotch started to go up. And, you know, we were, after a scotch or two, you start to get creative. And we were belly aching about the price going up. And, you know, we had joked that we could either figure out how to shorten the period of time it needed to age or build a time machine, go back and tell them to put more in barrels.
Right.
So he was also a PhD, worked on big machines. And, you know, the idea sort of lingered out there and we're like, all right, let's go mess around. And that was sort of the initial catalyst of the whole thing, was us just being upset at supply shortage or causing a price increase. Yep. So we didn't think much of it, you know, both tinkered a little bit because of our background. And I went on to be the CEO of a company called Fat Shark, which builds all the VR goggles for drone racing. Mm-hmm. So again, 100 nights a year in China, building VR headsets, you know, 50 to 100,000 units a year we were shipping. And in the middle of that, Sean, my co-founder, comes back to me and goes, "Hey, I might have something here." And he ships me some samples of a whiskey. And it wasn't good. You know, the first time you have any of it, none of it's good, but it showed that there was maybe a way to change how the manufacturing was done. And so we ended up kicking this thing off, and it's now an ongoing endeavor. It's been about 4 years now, a little more than 4 years, and we have a few products that are out there now, but in particular, we're just starting to ship our what we call a portfolio project to really represent to people what this sort of technology can do, which is a bottle called WK Reed. And if you search for WK Reed or go to wkreed.com, you can order a bottle, you can try it, which is kind of fun because it's basically a whiskey made from a bourbon mash. So it's pretty much a bourbon. That was aged in a day. And, we can get into the background of how all that came about, but really that's a long path.
Before we get into the background of what you guys are up to, I think, I have the advantage of having worked in the bourbon and whiskey world. So I know how this stuff is done, but for our general audience who may not know how spirits are born, get to be spirits. Walk us through what that typical production looks like.
Absolutely, and please jump in here if I'm derailing. I knew nothing about this before we started the company, by the way. I just knew 12 years in a barrel seemed crazy. So this was all an education for me. Spirits production is extremely high tech, a very, very sophisticated industry that's been around a long time. You start by making a beer or a mash or whatever, but it's basically making beer without hops. And even in this, you measure all the time for the alcohol percentages. You use specifically genetically tailored yeast. You have this agricultural flow that comes in that's all part of this huge supply chain, which is really neat. And then you make this beer, which is an organic process, but super controlled at a large scale. And then you boil it. And you boil it to pull off the ethanol and maybe some of the other flavor components. And in boiling it, you use a still. And there are two different types of stills. There's a column still and a pot still. Pot still doesn't get the same ethanol concentration out. So you normally come out at about 70%, where a column still can get up to 98%.
Yep.
What comes out there is what people call white dog or new distillate or it's clear. Yeah, it's moonshine. Exactly. It's moonshine. Whether it's vodka or whiskey or whatever, that's sort of what the beer is made out of. So like rum might be sugarcane, where bourbon would be 50% corn in terms of what that initial starting mash is.
And so people should know, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people have tasted the flavored moonshine and all that, but regular white dog is awful tasting.
Ooh. It is. Yes. And like you even just put a little on the tip of your tongue, and because of the percentage, it'll go in. For the people in states where it's legal to buy, Everclear is a pretty good example of a white dog that comes out that doesn't have a lot done to it. So this white liquor is either then filtered and proofed down to make vodka, boiled through basically tea bags to make gin. And so that's where you get the white liquors. And the distillation process is extremely sophisticated. Even the water that goes into proofing it down is normally measured. And so the production of white liquor is pretty quick, because you make the mash, you boil it, you proof it, you filter it, all using very, very high-tech equipment and processes.
Scientific, industrial equipment.
Absolutely. I mean, in some cases, these large distilleries look like more like oil refineries than they do the traditional notion of going into, the craft distiller where they're using a Bunsen burner or doing some boutique, very difficult to repeat process.
Yep.
And then the bottling line and the labeling lines are all automated and they fill. And it's extremely impressive to see these things in action, to understand the sophistication of the machine all the way through the palletization and distribution of the different bottles. What's really interesting to me is that in the manufacturing of brown liquor or aged spirits, after this, they make this white distillate, they proof it down to barrel proof, and then they literally put it in oak barrels.
Yep.
And they take those oak barrels and they put them in a warehouse. For instance, I believe that Woodford Reserve, pretty common bourbon, is aged an average of 9 years in temperature-controlled warehouses. Okay, 9 years in a warehouse. We'll get back to that in an oak barrel. There's not a lot of science here. You know, the temperature controlled warehouse is a new process, which is high tech for the industry, I would say.
Yeah.
And then a master blender, these different barrels have different parameters even inside the warehouse. You know, the top barrels will have a different alcohol percentage in the air. They'll evaporate differently. There'll be a different temperature. And so the master blenders go and take these different barrels and they find the right mix to keep the flavor profile. Most of these guys are super tasters. They're incredible. Yep. Master blenders are incredible people. It blows my mind. And then they'll blend those at a high scale and they'll go through the rest of the process. When you look at manufacturing at scale for liquor, there's 2 or 3 really challenging parts to this method of maturation. The first is those barrels in the Woodford Reserve Warehouse or in anywhere similar where they're doing 9 years. Yep. When you open them up, on average, they're half empty.
Right.
So you get the alcohol that evaporates.
The angel share.
Yeah. That's a cute name for Lost. You know, if in consumer electronics I had a 50% yield rate, I would be.
Yeah, so that's a critical point, though, as we get to what you do for people to remember is this traditional way of kind of blend of art and science does necessitate tremendous loss.
It does. It does with the way that it's done. I think that's a very good point. But in any other manufacturing industry, that would have been a non-starter.
Oh, yeah.
For yields or for loss rate.
Right.
The second thing it requires is this huge amount of working capital because you have to fill these barrels year after year after year after year and then put them on the shelf, which is a financing challenge.
Yeah, it's the financing for sure, but also the forecasting because you're needing to put away what you think you're going to sell, 5, 7, 12, whatever aging period years down the road.
Well, that's exactly right. And that's why we see these dramatic shifts in some of the pricing of brown liquor bottles. And that forecasting problem was actually the thing that inspired us to start, right? Price of scotch was going up because of the 12-year lag.
Yep.
The third problem that I think, and the third big problem I would say with all this is that these producers have to build so much more capacity up front.
Yep.
Because let's say you want 100 barrels 10 years from now. It means right now you have to build plants to fill 200 barrels worth rather than 100 barrels worth. And so you have to get way in front of the consumption of everything and is part of that planning. And so there's this much larger CapEx cost that you incur very early in the process as well that I think makes this element of brown spirits manufacturing, I think, challenging inside the industry from a financial perspective. Yeah. At the same time, these large entities that have the material flow, your Brown Formans, your Beam Centauris, and these master distillers make extremely good products. Their ability to use this traditional process to make things that we all love and consume and do it at a price point that is quite frankly absurd. You can go buy a bottle of Jack Daniels for under $30.
Yep.
That's incredible. And so I think there's that process is extremely sophisticated at this point. And I think it's absolutely something to recognize if you're looking at this in marketplace.
Yeah. Well,
they've gotten very good at it.
Barrier to entry for competitors too.
Oh, absolutely. No question. So when we were starting BarrelRM, we looked at this and it wasn't about the science to try to mature things faster. One of the constraints on what we did was that it has to fit in the current manufacturing ecosystem for large producers. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the volumes that large producers produce, what it means is that you have to use traditional equipment. We can't build a custom nano filter or something because that would be very difficult to scale. Yep. We also, there's a lot of magic to the interactions with the wood. And there's a lot of understanding on how to create flavors and how to blend and how to make products consumers like. So we restricted ourselves to just using alcohol, wood from the same cooperages, because it could be sourced at scale, air, and water.
And so let me break in, going back to that point about the moonshine tasting terrible. It is that aging in the barrel that winds up making it taste wonderful, like your bottle of Jim Beam or Jack Daniels.
If we take a step back to that, it's a couple pieces, right? A wooden barrel looks like a sponge,
right?
And normally they'll char it or whatever else. And in the case of bourbon, it's the first time, so it has a lot more flavor to give. In the case of Scotch, it's generally a second or third use.
The wood
barrel
itself gives flavor to the liquid.
Absolutely. And so what they'll do is they'll char the wood. And there's different layers. There's a char layer, which is kind of a neat charcoal filter, which will pull out impurities. There's a toast layer where you get like your vanillas. And then there's the actual wood layer. And the weather in these warehouses moves the alcohol in and out. And then you also get this evaporation. And so you get this esterification and secondary chemical maturation processes that occur that don't have anything to do with the wood.
Right.
So in terms of understanding the impact of the barrel, and it really does smooth out the liquor, adds these interesting flavors, and you'll get these single barrel expressions. And those can be very one-noted. It could be very vanilla, for instance.
Right.
And then what the blenders do is they take some of these different expressions to create these really complex flavors with a blending ratio and go from moonshine, which is terrible, to these things where you're willing to drink it neat, which, is, I think, is it really impressive.
Yep.
Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah.
So really,
and that's important because what you guys are doing is short-cutting that whole aging process, right?
Yeah, what I would say is we're trying to achieve the same effects that aging achieves in terms of maturation and in terms of these interactions with the barrel in a more modern process.
Yep.
Right. And we're not trying to change the tools people have or anything else, just the time it takes. I think there's a pretty good analogy my co-founder likes to use. The way that it's produced right now is like making cold brew coffee. You put the coffee grounds in a jar in the fridge, and whether you open it in 60 hours or 70 hours, it's coffee. Yeah. But it takes 60 or 70 hours, and we're making an espresso machine.
Yeah.
It doesn't change the coffee. It doesn't change the water. It just changes the environmental parameters to get what you want out of the coffee in 20 seconds.
Yeah.
Now, what's true about that is we've all had bad espresso. It's hard to make bad cold brew coffee because the sensitivity of this accelerated process is really high. And so, it's taken us a lot of years to build not only the espresso machine, but figure out how to use it to make pretty good espresso.
Well, and we should also say that you guys aren't the originators of the idea of shortcutting the barrel aging. Many people have tried it and failed for that very reason.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even, there are many people trying it right now. I would say that if you look, the patents on this sort of stuff have been around since the 1930s.
Yep.
Coming out of Prohibition, everybody was had a shortage of delicious brown liquor. Yeah. So there's a whole lot of IP in there, but we didn't look at it from can we science this? It was much more, okay, how can we build into the manufacturing flow? And the other thing that we think is really important is we're not trying to replace these amazing, halo products where, the really old Bacardi rums or some of the 18-year-old scotches are amazing.
Yeah.
Like that's not the objective. When we looked at all of this, and it's not an exact parallel because we're a direct replacement, we looked at Beyond and Impossible Foods, and we wanted to emulate some of the things that they did. And the things that we think they did well was they started with hamburger. Hamburger is interesting because it goes in a burger. And so you're not eating it with a fork and knife or whatever. And we look at the spirits that we're making as being designed for cocktail spirits. If we make a whiskey, which is what WK Reed is, it's not there trying to be super interesting. It's there so you can make your whiskey ginger, your old fashioned, your Manhattan, and have that come out really well.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I think those two companies did a very good job of that a lot of the modern food manufacturing folks, I think, sometimes forget is they spent years working on their product until it crossed a threshold where you thought, oh, yeah, this is good enough. I mean, they spent time before they rolled it out figuring out how to make it mimic the bleeding of a burger, for instance, right? All of these details, because the hamburger industry is commoditized and hamburgers are delicious. And they, Boca Burger, these other alternatives have been around a long time. And so it's really execution, I think, in the manufacturing and in the product itself that enabled them to enter a market where people have been operating a long time.
Yep.
So we took those same ideas to heart, in addition to the restrictions on only using the same material, because we thought any sort of chemistry gets weird. This is a product people are consuming. Yep. And we didn't want to do additives or anything else. It just, those restrictions made it harder. But in the end, it puts us much closer to that sort of tastes familiar, behaves familiarly for any of the producers, makes your cocktails the way you'd expect.
Yeah.
But again, a lot of bad liquor along the way.
Right. But, you also have to have an acceptability factor for consumers who are used to the traditional as well. Not having additives, not having chemistry that people are increasingly leery of for good reason.
Oh, yeah. For great reason, right?
Yeah.
And not only that, we, again, another interesting thing about the liquor industry is a lot of people buy bulk liquor from each other to make the final products that they need to make. If in your warehouse you don't have that vanilla leg, you might go buy it from a partner, and you might trade them a pepper leg or whatever else to realize your finished product.
Yep.
So what we're really good at is isolating these specific single barrel expressions and then doing blends.
Yep.
So if you take a look, I know over the years we've shipped you some stuff, and almost all the stuff you've had so far has been these single barrel expressions. Right. And there are these very pronounced flavor profiles. WK Reed is a blend of 3 different single barrels. It's a traditional 3 parts base, 2 parts vanilla because it's a bourbon, and then 1 part sort of, we like to call it sparkle, the things that give the complexity and the finish and everything. And so where we see a lot of interest, and actually where we saw our first commercial success, was in selling bulk rum rather than whiskey to some of the people making canned cocktails. And that's where this has its first best application in the market. I think what a lot of people don't understand is when you go buy a canned cocktail, if you're buying a White Claw versus a whiskey soda, as a consumer, you expect them to be at the same price. As a producer, if you have to go pull 6-year-old barrels of whiskey to make your whiskey soda, you can't produce price competitively with a vodka soda.
Yeah.
Our process brings the production costs for some of those legs down. And because we can tailor specific flavors to make that final product without any additives, it lets what are called the formulators, the people who really make those final products and dial in maybe the slight amount of citric acid or whatever or the carbonation level into the canned drinks. It lets them have all the tools that they would normally have at their disposal.
Right.
So it's,
well, and we mentioned this before we got on, there's the availability factor these days because of the crazy boom in brown goods. It's been going on for far longer than any of us ever anticipated, right?
Oh, yeah. No, I think everybody's pretty shocked by it. And, if we wanted to start a liquor company years ago or start a brand or even start a canned cocktail, you'd go to like MGP, I think most famously, and they'd sell you 2 or 4-year-old barrels, and they made really good whiskey.
Yep.
High West famously started as working with MGP and bringing it in for a long time till they started their own stuff.
Right.
MGP won't sell barrels to anyone anymore. A whole bunch of people won't because they don't have enough aging product for their own product lines.
Right. Yeah. And some of the big names used to also sell to places like that. And they're definitely, they haven't done it for years because they're using all their capacity to make their own juice.
Yeah. And they're rapidly trying to put in place more capacity.
Yeah, exactly.
So in the case for any of these experimental or let's call them new initiatives, the ready to drinks or the ready to serves, we end up having a lot of interest and doing some production for those groups.
Yep.
And we think that's a win for the customer, because our whole process takes 1 day instead of the 6 to 8 years that it would take with a traditional barrel. And that lets us be flexible.
Let's repeat that. 1 day versus years in a warehouse in a barrel. So.
Yeah, that's right. So if you want to try one day old whiskey, order WK Reed, try a bottle. You know, it's surprising for 1 day old, you know, and then try some White Dog and realize that, again, it's interesting, and it's just the same, applying the same principles that have been applied to the rest of the manufacturing line in terms of controlling the fermentations, which used to be random and inconsistent, and the bottling's all automated. And, you know, we're just applying the same principles to this last part of the production chain.
Yep.
So, you know, we're pretty excited about it. But yeah, 1 day old. And it also means that if you're going to launch, you know, Jim's whiskey lemonade, which we can talk about offline. I mean, you should do it. It'd be great. That you could come to us and we can deliver the flavor profile you want for your lemonade. And we don't need to make as much, and you wouldn't need to guess at your volumes, because I don't need to put aside barrels for you for years, and you can't go source it from someone else. And even if you went and bought a couple of barrels from somewhere, your input might change.
Yep.
Yeah. And I guess one of the, go ahead.
I was just going to ask a question, because you had mentioned you're industrializing this part of the process that was definitely not industrialized other than scale before. But, you know, one thing I loved being part of that spirits world was the art piece of it. So you mentioned using the same woods and everything. I have to imagine there's still an art to what you do as well, and some of those elements that go into making what your final product in every batch is going to be. Is that correct?
Absolutely. That is a phenomenally true statement that I've missed with some of the science. And we have a ton of respect for the master distillers for that reason.
Yep.
So the first thing that I would say I learned in this process, if we go way back to early on, we were making mixed drinks. In this case, rum and Coke, because we started working with Cayman Spirits Company as our first pilot test.
And I should have mentioned you're talking to us from Puerto Rico right now.
I am. So I'd like the cool. Caribbean. Yeah. But so what I found out is that the nature of the spirit dramatically impacts the drink. You know, Bacardi, for instance, and actually Captain Morgan, make rum that is matched to Coke. A Bacardi and Coke or a Captain and Coke tastes like vanilla Coke. It just goes so well in there.
Yep.
In terms of that. Now, if you take a heavy wooded rum, something like Pussers, which is used, you know, in painkillers, which are pineapple and coconut, and put that in Coke, no thank you.
Right.
You know, you'll notice, you'll be like, whoa, this is tannicky, it tastes like wood. But if you took Bacardi and used it in a painkiller, you'd feel the same way.
Right.
You know, you'd much rather have a pina colada or a painkiller made with Pussers than you would with Bacardi. Yeah. And that's not saying anything bad about either one.
Right.
It was just this realization that the construction of the spirit itself not only has an impact on if you want to drink it neat, but then on the cocktails that you're making with it.
Yep.
So what's fascinating is with WK Reed, another analogy we like to use for what we're doing is we're engineers, my co-founders and I, and we've sort of learned a little bit about taste, but it's almost like we're building the program Photoshop, and we are good enough at making pictures to show an artist but we need the artist to use Photoshop to make stuff really wonderful.
Yep.
So in the case of WK Reed, we worked with a pretty famous hospitality person out of Chicago over a whole year and we'd send the blending legs to him, and he'd give us feedback on what elements to increase or decrease, or what elements were missing, what blend ratios to use. And that's how we ultimately came around to WK Reed. That was not us. That was somebody who's well known for barrel picks and creating custom cocktails and everything else. And I won't reveal who it is, because the base of this was to eventually drive to a ready to serve cocktail line. Mm-hmm. So, like a really premium canned cocktail. So we started with the base spirit and we wanted to put it out there, but absolutely requires that artistry of a master distiller who can go in and understand what is delicious and what is not, and then what different pieces to put together to make it. Another way to look at it is you could take me and Emerald and put us in the same kitchen with the same ingredients. He's going to make a better meal. Yeah. And it's sort of the same thing here. Those people, I think, we give them more options. You don't have to wait 40 years now for a barrel, or we can isolate certain flavors more strongly with our process. So we actually think this can create a real opportunity for those flavor artists and those master distillers to create some. We're pretty excited about the creations that we expect to see come out of these sorts of techniques.
Yeah, and it opens doors for future entrepreneurs as well. I mean, it has to have been the case that people who wanted to get into the business have struggled these last 5 years just with availability of the raw materials for what they might have wanted to make, and you guys can open that up again. So to me, that's phenomenal.
Yeah, thank you. And that's a very good point. It's not just the availability, which is true. The entry price for traditional brown spirits brands is really high. Yep. And we also lower that because we don't have the same requirements. So we are working with 4 other brands, startup brands, as a primary provider that should all be launching this summer. So very much to that point, like as a producer, which we are.
Is Jim's Whiskey Lemonade one of those? Because if it is, I got to get busy.
No. I said this summer. I isolate that for a spring release, right? Right. Yeah. No, I mean,
I still got to get busy.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, let's get on that. Yeah, I'm excited. Go with your shirt and just be
absolutely. Yep.
It's very strong and be very excited. I think everybody be all about it. But yeah, no, we're launching. To your point, we have several people who want to start brands that are working with us, and we have bottles incoming. One of them is actually launching in Japan. We're in a couple of canned cocktail drinks, so we're excited about all that sort of that immediate opportunity and growth.
Yeah.
And what's great,
it has to be tremendous. I mean, the potential there.
Yeah, the potential to create new flavors, and I think the potential to create new stories. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the traditional producers are tied to this legacy idea of the barrel, and there's a lot of value in that, but there's also a lot of value in this method of production, for instance, reduces the environmental impact of brown spirits by more than 50%.
Very good point.
So, right? Because you don't have to boil twice as much of everything. You're not using twice as much energy. We use 5% of the wood of a barrel.
Yep.
And there's, a little bit of an oak shortage. We also don't have the alcohol evaporation that creates some of the black mold. So I think this production technique has an environmental story to tell for certain brands, and we're excited about the different emergent brand stories and positioning and value propositions that different customer segments can see out of this.
Yep.
So,
and then as you think about down the road, are there other opportunities that you have yet to explore? Things that, because of your development process and the opportunities you have today, you're pushing off maybe 5-10 years down the road?
Yeah. I mean, again, if you look back at Impossible or Beyond, they started with burgers and then they moved to certain other categories.
Yep.
We're not there yet. What we're doing is we have this first thing and it's just good enough, and we're starting to scale it a little bit. There is one really cool thing that we're in the middle of that we have done some of. We've taken our spirit matured after a day and put it in wine barrels. So we put rum in a sherry cask for about 9 months. It comes out really, really nice. So we see this opportunity for not what we call the bottom of the top shelf, which is our traditional products that you put in a spirit, but these really provide an opportunity for halo products. Really, really nice finished things that are still done in a very reasonable period of time in the industry.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. Is kind of that hybrid production model of using yours for the initial very short aging, but then having some additional time of a more traditional aging method that finishes it off. That's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, again, we're all for barrel aged spirits.
Yeah,
right? We're not here to throw it out or to say it's a broken model. There's so much to it that's good. Yep. We just want to provide another option for producers. Sure. So yeah, we see some of those finishes in particular as really coming out quite nice, and those products otherwise take a long time, right? Macallan is well known for their sherry cask finishes, but they're 12 years into the production cycle. If they could make it 6 months, or if you wanted to do, you wanted to test a finish to see how it works, you could use this to see if, a port barrel finish or something weird, if it came out in a way that you would expect or not. But we see that as a path for producers that use this technique in traditional manufacturing to still enable those more sophisticated, higher value, higher quality products.
Yep.
Yeah.
Good deal. All right. So what haven't we talked about people ought to know?
Heavy automation. So the only way that this works, and where I think some of the other processes in the past haven't been able to achieve maybe the same quality output, is that everything on ours is super censored, super automated, super reproducible, and it runs on about 8 presses of a button on a tablet to do the whole thing.
Interesting.
The next part is we scale everything to fit inside logistics. So our pilot processor uses what is a tote, which is an IBC, 270 gallons, the things that are used to ship food all over, because we can pull it in, run it, fill it back up, ship it out, or move it to the bottling line or whatever else. Mm-hmm. The next size up will do a tanker. And so I think if you look at building manufacturing technologies, building into the supply chain and the logistics flow is extremely important.
Yep.
A piece to this style of production is it no longer creates geographical bounds for production reasons. I'm not saying that tequila is not Mexico and bourbon's not Kentucky, but what traditionally why those regions have that demarcation, particularly for brown spirits, is because the weather's the same there. So the warehouses are consistent.
Yep.
So it'd be very hard for Jack Daniels to manufacture Jack Daniels with warehouses in Florida, because the maturation process would be very different. Because this is a completely controlled environment, it allows for distributed production. What is fascinating about that is because of the super long timelines in brown spirits production, particularly in whiskeys, tariffs, and the big tariff fight of a few years ago was on brown spirits. Right? They would cross tax where, for instance, vodka, you'll just make vodka somewhere else because you can do it in a few weeks and you're not geographically bound.
Yep.
So this production technology allows for distributed production rather than single location production of the exact same spirit, which is really, really effective for emerging markets like India, where there's high import tariffs and they want regional production while maintaining high consistency of product, which we think is important. So those are some of the other...
It's another piece of your sustainability story too.
Absolutely. It reduces, and it's also manufacturing, right? This is a commodity industry. When you look at a commodity industry, everybody is super mature. They use great processes, and there's not margins to, it's nobody's got 100% margin.
Right.
And so the best way to improve the efficiency of any of these manufacturers is to change the cost basis.
Yep.
And this addresses, 50% of the total cost basis of brown liquor production. So we think there's some value to it.
Yeah, lots of interesting elements to your story. And I look forward to keeping in touch, and like we have been for several years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kind of go into the commercialization phase.
Yeah, I'm very excited and hope to give a very positive update in a couple of years on giant machines, but
Yep. Well,
in the meantime, go ahead.
I was going to say, we at Manufacturing Talks are here every week. So you let me know when you want to come back and give us that update, and we'll have you back on.
Yeah, well, what I'd also love is feedback from your audience on if they try it at wkreed.com and their opinions on what this type of production technology does for a bourbon and what they like and don't like, because, ultimately it comes down to personal preference and what people think about a product and taste. And so we're always looking for feedback on that too.
Yes. So definitely, folks, get out there and check it out, and come back onto our YouTube site and put your comments down there, and they'll make their way back to Allan and his cohort. Yeah. Well, Allan, it has been an absolute pleasure learning about what you have going on, and I appreciate you being here.
Hey, Jim, I really appreciate the time. This has been fun. Thank you.
Yep. And of course, to all of you guys, thanks as always for joining us for Manufacturing Talks. Like I said, we're here every week. Can't promise every story is going to be as ultimately cool and interesting as the one Allan brought us today, but it'll be cool and interesting for sure. Thanks again.
Thanks for tuning in to Manufacturing Talks with Jim Vinosky. Watch for new episodes dropping every Tuesday. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe.